Well, good morning and welcome again. I am the Reverend Danae Ashley, and I am so glad to be here with you this morning. Now, it's the 10:30 service, so we've all had some caffeine, I hope. I want to invite you to imagine a scene. You are at church, and it's time for communion. The organ is softly playing a hymn as you walk to the communion rail to kneel and receive Christ's body and blood. You are in a prayerful state when suddenly you hear a female voice hissing next to you, "Witch!" and the sound of spit flying out of the person's mouth, and you watch as it lands on the hand of your priest, a woman serving the bread. The priest calmly wipes the glob of spit off with a Kleenex while balancing the paten of bread, and then moves on to give you Christ's body. This scenario, as well as being bitten while serving communion, cursed at, bread thrown, people remaining in the pew with their arms crossed and glaring, harassing the female priest and their families outside the church, and other cruel behaviors happened to many of the early female Episcopal priests. Stunning, I know, in this day and age, right? And while many female-identifying lay people supported those early priests, there were many who didn't. Some were jealous because they felt called to ordained ministry, but were dissuaded because the church didn't ordain women in their time, and now they felt it was too late for them. Some thought it was unnatural, whatever that means. Some believed it wasn't biblical. Hello, have you read the Gospels and the book of Acts? Women were ministering everywhere. But in the context of a patriarchal system, it was, as Brazilian philosopher and educator Paulo Freire wrote, the oppressed, instead of striving for liberation, tend themselves to become the oppressors. Human nature has not changed much in millennia, as we hear in our readings today. Our Hebrew scriptures are so earthy, aren't they? Their stories are so very human. Today, they tell us the tale of two women, Sarai, meaning the princess, and Hagar, meaning the outsider. In fact, Hagar is not even a proper name. It is just the term in Hebrew for a foreigner, alien, or sojourner. Plus, Hagar was from Egypt, the place where earlier in Genesis, Sarai herself had been enslaved by Pharaoh as one of his wives. Abram, wanting to save his own skin in that scenario, convinced her to pretend she was his sister when they traveled there instead of his wife. It took God sending plagues, plural, on the house of Pharaoh as punishment for Abram to speak up and take Sarai back to the land of Canaan. Sarai and Abram did not have children, and as you heard in last week's story, Sarah ended up laughing about that. And in this patriarchal world that valued a woman's body for sexual pursuits and childbearing, Sarai was trapped. How does one gain power in an oppressive society? By oppressing someone else, of course. Who needs liberation when you can exert power over another? Why would anyone else need to be free if I'm not? So, Sarai takes her Egyptian slave girl Hagar and gives her to Abram to have a child with. The Israelites did this frequently. It was a patriarchal culture that enslaved others, just like the other cultures of their time. Typically, any child an enslaved woman would have this way would belong to her mistress and or master. However, Hagar conceived easily and treated Sarai with contempt until Abram intervened, allowing Sarai to abuse Hagar so badly that Hagar ran away. And here's where God does something new. Hagar has the first annunciation. Now, I know it's not Advent. We often only think that annunciation was for Mary, but it is not. An angel of the Lord comes to Hagar and tells her to return to Sarai and submit to the abuse. You know how there are some parts of Scripture that you say to God, "What are you doing? That's a horrible idea." Well, this is one of them for me. But the angel assures her, all this suffering will not be in vain. The angel tells her she will bear a son, and his name should be called Ishmael. God listens. And her offspring will be greatly multiplied, so much so that they cannot be counted for multitude. Sound familiar? The language, of course, being an annunciation, is similar to Mary's annunciation, and then also later Abraham will also receive this same promise. But Hagar, a powerless woman, receives it first. Then Hagar does something no one else does in our canon. She names God. The name she uses is El Roi, God of seeing, saying, "Have I seen the one who sees me and lived to tell of it?" Friends, Hagar is not to be trifled with. Hagar goes back to the house of Abraham and Sarai and gives birth to Ishmael. And all of this happens in Genesis 16. Now, in today's reading, we fast forward to Genesis 21. A lot has happened. Abram becomes Abraham, Sarai becomes Sarah, a covenant was made, Sarah laughed about having a baby in her old age, but then had Isaac, and time passes. Meanwhile, Ishmael and Hagar continue to be in Abraham and Sarah's household, with Ishmael growing into early adolescence. And the plot thickens. Sarah finally has Isaac, the true heir, and her jealousy flares when she sees the young man Ishmael is growing into. She tells Abraham to send them away, hoping they will die in the wilderness. Jealousy, power plays, the oppressed oppressing others. Human nature has not changed, has it? And Abraham does what Sarah wishes, but only after God promises him that he will have offspring from both Ishmael and Isaac. Y'all, Abraham is a weak man caught in a system that lets no one win. And is anyone else wondering what God is doing here? So Hagar sets out into the wilderness and wanders there until her food and water run out. She leaves Ishmael resting in some bushes and sits a distance away from him, weeping. God hears her cries, as well as the voice of Ishmael, and comes to Hagar as an angel of God calling from heaven. She and Ishmael are led to a well of water, as well as being reassured of God's promises to Hagar about Ishmael. Then we are told, very briefly, that God is with Ishmael as he grows up, and his mother, a single mother, who had to be both mother and father to him, got a wife for him, which is normally a father's job, from her land, the land of Egypt. Thus, God's promises are fulfilled, and something else important happens. Hagar and Ishmael are free. They are free. In that patriarchal society, Abraham could have sold them to someone else. Instead, God frees them. God's saving acts are truly for all. And God frees them, but the suffering before the freedom. The price of freedom seems to be suffering in some way, shape, or form. So where is God in this? Hagar was trapped in a patriarchal society whose systems kept people in their places. As a family systems therapist, I know how difficult it is to change a family system, to change an institutional system, to change a church system, to change a societal system. There has to be deep and intentional work, not just by an individual, but by every single person in the system. You see, when I work with clients on becoming differentiated in their family systems, the system itself exists to keep the status quo, and it does not want a person in the system to rise to a level of healthiness that the system is not at. It wants the person to stay in their place, to play their role, so that the system will be stabilized even in its dysfunction. So, question for you. Has anyone ever lived far away from their family, but if they go back home for a holiday, they immediately play the role they were in as a child? Okay. Many people end up sitting in the same seat for meals, sleep in their old room, get in similar fights with their family as if they were 10 years old again. That's the family system. That's the power. Those within it make compromises to secure safety so they feel like they belong. And some families are safe systems, but others are not. It's a tough one to redeem alone and is in fact impossible. But you can self-differentiate for yourself, but unless everyone else wants to be healthier, that is all you can do. So, when we live in a society that has embedded oppression in the system, what happens to us? This is at the heart of the missionary discourse that we hear from Jesus in Matthew today. Jesus, too, is living within the same patriarchal system that Hagar was, addressing a community who were faithful, even though they were facing conflict and discouragement from others, even their own families. And so this passage reminded the disciples, the Matthean community it was written for, and now us, that we must have faith over the fear of losing our place in the world. Remember, even Jesus had conflicts with his own family. Jesus himself was differentiated and knew a prophet could not return to their hometown or their family without judgment and expectation. These early Christians were learning what true discipleship meant, seeking God above all else, and that it comes with a price. When we die to sin in our baptism, we cannot go on living in it. When we follow Jesus, we cannot live the way we lived before. When a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, it cannot go back to its old form. One of my professors at Sewanee taught that we are not free until the most marginalized of us is free, until the Hagars of the world are free. The cost of discipleship means that we are called into the wilderness of discomfort with Hagar. Discipleship changes us. Following Jesus makes us free, but we are often like a bird in a cage for so long that when you open the door to let it out, it won't go. The life outside of the systems that we have created is too frightening to imagine, even though it's exciting. And yet, we will never know what could be if we do not step across the threshold. It is the wilderness. It is God. And we leave now.